Hello and welcome to the first episode of the Empowering Lives video series brought to you by the Department of Psychology here at Help University. My name is Elaine Fernandez. I am the head of the Psychology Department at Help, and today I'm joined by Lochna, who is the Information and Communications Officer at the All Women's Action Society, also known as AWAM. We'll be discussing the rise in domestic violence rates in Malaysia since the start of the movement controlled order in March, and what people can do to support themselves and their families if they are currently in an abusive relationship. So hi, Lochna, thank you for joining us today.
Happy to be here.
Okay, so just to start off, we'd just like to know what was the situation like in Malaysia for women suffering from domestic violence before the MCO, and what has happened since in terms of the number of cases and the women who've been reaching out for help.
Okay, so in terms of how the situation has changed, well, the difference is that before the MCO, um, people who are survivors of domestic violence could actually access certain things under the law. For example, they could go to the police station, they could make a report, they could apply for protection orders, things like that. But with the MCO, things are a bit difficult because number one, um, it's difficult to have access to family and friends, which basically make up your support system. And you're trapped at home with the perpetrator, where else, as before, some women would go to the office, um, and there was a bit of that distance from the perpetrator in that sense. But with the MCO, it's like 24 hours at home with the perpetrator. And this is very specifically where the situations are women. I mean, in the example that I'm giving. Um, but I mean, domestic violence is definitely broader than that. It can happen, there's elder abuse where the domestic violence happens between an adult and their parent. And there's also child abuse. And we've seen that a lot in the news as well recently. Um, so in terms of what has changed with the MCO is that there is, especially at the beginning of the MCO, was that people were not allowed to go out uh, to get help. And if, for example, let's say there was a violent incident that happens after 7 o'clock, for example, and the survivor has to leave the home, and they would have to break MCO, and then there's that kind of legal aspect to it where you're actually breaking the law and you can be fined for doing so. Aside from that, it's also access to the courts that has been limited. So before, what would happen is that you could go to the police station, you could make a report, and using that report, you can actually go to the courts and apply for a protection order. But because the courts are shut down, now it's difficult to go to the courts and get that protection order. Where else as before, everything could be done within 24 hours. And now it's like it's taking days and sometimes maybe even weeks. Um, Aside from that, one other very important aspect is also going to the hospital, because when, especially in cases where people actually go to the police and they open an investigation paper, and they will require you to go to a hospital or clinic kesihatan to do a checkup, because that is where they will get all the medical evidence to kind of start the investigation paper. But because of COVID-19, a lot of women were actually hesitant to go to the hospitals because they were afraid that they would contract COVID-19 and bring it home. So that is also another layer that is kind of missed out sometimes.
Right, right. So there have been a lot of obstacles for people accessing help in the
Yes.
MCO period. Um, have there been more calls, or have you seen a change in people looking for help, perhaps being unable to know what to do given the change in circumstances?
I think definitely I mean, we ourselves have received a lot of cases, especially pertaining to sexual harassment,
Mm.
domestic violence, and even in some cases for financial assistance as well. Um, And there has been this increase. Unfortunately for, fortunately for AWAM lah, I won't say it's unfortunate, that we've not seen a very steep increase
Okay.
in terms of our calls. But WAO, Women's Aid Organization, saw a 44% increase in their number of cases.
Mm.
And um, Talian Kasih, the Ministry of Women's Helpline, saw a 51% increase in calls to Talian Kasih. And I think at one point, they even had 4,000 WhatsApp messages coming into their WhatsApp line a day. Now, not all these cases are domestic violence, but I mean, it is an indication of, you know, a lot of the issues, and even to a large extent, violence that people are experiencing
Mm.
as a result of the MCO.
Yeah. I think you also mentioned that there are other types of abuse that can constitute domestic violence. So you've also mentioned elder abuse, you've mentioned child abuse. Are there any other types of, abuse within a relationship that we might not be so aware of? So, like you mentioned, part of the issue was them not actually being able to access medical attention, but not all types of violence is necessarily just physical violence. Is that correct?
For sure. And I mean, there are kind of two layers to your questions as well.
Mm.
The first one would be types of violence within relationships. And that's actually something that we don't see a lot. So one example would be dating violence,
Mm.
and the other one would be sorry, I am so used to the abbreviation. It's the IPR, intimate partner violence.
Right.
Especially in the case of LGBT,
Mm.
because in Malaysia they cannot get legally married, so a lot of them kind of live together, and with intimate partner relationships, they cannot access, for example, protection orders under the Domestic Violence Act, because their partnership is not seen as marriage.
Right.
And what happens is that it leaves them vulnerable to abuse without a lot of options and without a lot of support as well.
Mm.
So that's definitely one dimension to domestic violence that is largely unspoken,
Yeah.
or that people just kind of dismiss. Another part is definitely dating violence, and I think in Malaysia we don't really talk about dating violence that much, um, but it is a very big issue as well, because um, when I was at university 10 years ago, date rape is something that we talked about a lot, and it happened to a lot of girls at university. We've had interns who have come in and talked about their personal stories, and some of them were also victims of um, date rape. It's a large issue that I think we've not really kind of tackled as well. Also, the sense of um, because in Malaysia, we kind of think that, oh, you can't behave a certain way before marriage, and
Yeah.
the whole idea of you know not having premarital sex, and why are you spending so much time with this boy anyway, so but that is definitely a big issue that also needs to be looked at. The other aspect to your question is other types of abuse that we see in relationships.
Mhm.
There are two significant, the main ones that we see is definitely physical violence, mental and emotional violence, and also under the law, damage to property. So where, property has been um, taken under deceit, or whether someone has applied for a loan in your name,
Right.
something like that. Like that is covered by law.
Oh, okay.
But there are other aspects to domestic violence that is not addressed. For example, financial violence and tech violence. So, so we receive a lot of cases in our where, for example, the husband doesn't go to work, or the husband is a recovering drug user, or the husband has been diagnosed with some kind of mental disorder and stays at home and forces the wife to kind of go to work. And then what happens is that he takes her salary, beats her up, and goes out. And then he comes home, and the cycle repeats. And that is something that um, happens a lot, especially in cases where they force the wife to take a loan because they want to start a business or something, and they threaten to beat her up, or they threaten to divorce her and take the kids, or they threaten to burn down the house. Like, these things happen. And the woman feels, or the survivor in this case, feels that she has no choice except to apply for the loan, and then they take the money and they run off, or they divorce in some cases, and she still has to pay back for the loan, even though he's already absconded with the money.
Right.
So that is something that I think is very tricky, and is something that is not discussed a lot. So that's financial violence. And then there's tech violence, where, for example, the spouse puts spy cams in the bathroom, or puts surveillance devices on, that they're basically monitoring you on social media, on your computer, what websites you're going to, who, they may even have certain locks that block you from accessing certain websites on your computer. So this is what we describe as tech violence. Yeah, so these are the two forms of violence that I think we've not really kind of delved into.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's something that people should know about, because I think we are quite familiar with the idea of physical abuse being violence or a form of domestic violence, but you've actually highlighted quite a lot of behaviors that I think not everyone necessarily recognizes as violence. Certainly, I think date rape, as you mentioned before, I think a lot of girls find it difficult to tell when they have been, whether they've given consent
Yes.
or
Yes,
not.
because it's that very blurry area, because I'm kind of in a relationship, like I feel I should be, having sex with this guy, and then that line of consent is kind of blurred a
Yeah.
little bit as well.
Yeah. So even if they didn't want to, if they didn't explicitly say so, they may not feel like they did enough to indicate, so they won't recognize that as rape. So I think it's very important, the difference that you brought it up. Would something like revenge porn fall under tech violence?
Okay, oh gosh, yes, yes. So we had a case last year, I think, where the husband had installed spy cams in, I think, the shower, and his wife found out about it, and after a while they separated, and he was mad at her, and he felt ashamed and all of this, so he actually printed out her pictures on a banner and put it in front of her mother's house.
Oh my.
And so the matter actually went to court, and because it's physical proof, it's physical evidence that he's done that. um, but because of the lack of family support in her case, it was lack of family support, because they felt ashamed, and they were like, stop pursuing any legal action, it's just going to make matters worse, he's just going to do more. And eventually the case was dismissed, because on the day of the hearing she didn't turn up at court. So because she also wanted to kind of close that chapter, and I understand where she's coming from, as a woman, I just want to be done with it. But he basically got away scot free. um, yes, but on the matter of revenge porn, it is a very big issue. um, and it would definitely fall under tech violence.
Yeah, I think you brought up a very important point as well about social support, and also the sort of face saving, I think, that comes along with a lot of these matters, particularly if there's a sexual element to it. It's very difficult for people to pursue justice simply because that means making it public and potentially having it in the newspapers and your neighbors finding out about it and so on. So I think the taboo nature of some of these, especially date rape or revenge porn and all of that, I think might be preventing a lot of people from reaching out to seek help and also to take their perpetrators to court and really see through the whole proceedings. Is that fair to say?
For sure. For sure, you're absolutely right. Um, I would just like to add that, I mean, it's a long process. I mean, the court process can be very long. I've known rape cases that has gone on for 8 years, sexual harassment cases that has gone on for 6 5 6 years. So it is a long drawn out process, and it can, many survivors tend to feel as if like the court process is holding them back
Mm,
from moving on, and very often you find them kind of, eventually kind of withdrawing the case just because they want to move on. um but it also means that the perpetrators go scot free. And even the Harvey Weinstein case in the US
yeah.
with the Me Too movement, it took several years, but he's behind bars now,
Mm,
and he deserves to be there.
yeah.
Yeah.
So on that note, I think probably a question that would be useful is what advice would you have for people who are contemplating whether or not to start this process? Because it can be quite daunting, as you just described. The expectation that it might go on for a long time, my finances might be affected by it, and so on. In addition to the fact that, as you say, you can't move on. Uh, do you have any advice for someone trying to make that decision, and what sort of factors they can consider that might help keep them on that path if they choose to take it?
I think the most important factor is to definitely is number one, to believe that you're worth it, to believe that you deserve to be happy, and to believe that you are more than what is happening to you. Yeah, this, a lot of survivors tend to lose themselves
Mm,
over the years, and many of them don't recognize themselves. Usually after a few years of being in an abusive relationship. And I would ask them to try as much to hold on to who they think they are, and who they are deep down, because that is ultimately going to get you through this. That there is an end. There is no darkness that lasts forever, and as long as you don't give up, there's hope.
okay, that's very very important, I think. Um, um, so dialing back a little bit, so before they even can get to court and all of that at this point, where can they access help? What sort of measures can they take right now? Particularly if there are children involved in the situation, or perhaps an elderly parent, because some of them might be living with their families and so on. Um, what can they do, and how can they access help right now? I think CMCO has a little bit less movement restriction, but they might still be a little bit wary. So, is there any advice that you can give on how they can seek help right now?
I think the best advice and the most important one is to always have a support system, even if that means identifying family, friends, um, anyone, maybe even neighbors or community leaders who can support you in this, who you trust, and who you can tell, you can send like an emergency SMS, and you know that they will pull through for you. And even if you don't have any, even if you think you don't have anyone like that, take a chance. you know you have to believe that someone out there is going to support you in this. um, I would also recommend you get in touch with certain women's rights organizations, such as AWAM, of course, Women's Aid Organization, Sisters in Islam, and Women's Center for Change in Penang.
Mm,
Um, these are definitely organizations you can get in touch, and they will assist you in developing a safety plan. Basically, help you identify spaces where you can keep safe, help you kind of decide how you want to communicate this to your children. Some children can be very averse to parents kind of separating. And what these organizations can do is they can kind of help you navigate that conversation as well. Most of these organizations also offer free counseling. So that's also something that you might want to explore.
And all of this can be accessed via telephone and WhatsApp right now.
Yes.
Am I right?
So exactly. So most of the women's rights organization have a WhatsApp number. So you could always, as and when, just text or call. Um, and usually they respond within 24 hours.
Okay, I think that's very good to know because I think people always think that calling this organization means wanting to come out of this. You have to want to come out of the situation at that point. When really there's other services that are available where you may not be able to really free yourself at the moment, but you can help to protect yourself as much as possible while you're still in that situation. So I think that's very useful for a lot of people who may not have uh, the or may not be in the right situation to leave their family as such right now. So they can have conversations and they will be talked through
Yes.
how to protect themselves, basically.
Yeah. It's actually very interesting that you brought that up because we noticed that a lot of times people who come to us telling that they want to separate from their spouse have usually been together for from 7 to 20 years,
Mm.
because they usually wait for their children to reach adulthood before they seek any kind of separation, whether it's divorce, um, separation, or persecuting for domestic violence.
Right. And we can understand that to some extent because they might be worried about what might happen to the child and whether they have the resources to take the child out of the situation as well. And also educate them. I think a lot of domestic violence survivors are quite dependent on on the spouses for financial assistance and things like that. So is that the case, or are we finding that it's a much more mixed group these days?
Um, I I would like to suggest that that's actually a myth.
Right.
Um, because I mean, even at AWAM, we get a lot of cases where people come to us for counseling for domestic violence. But when they seek legal assistance or legal information, um, it's for divorce.
Mm.
So oftentimes, those who are in very those who are very poor and who are really utterly dependent on their spouse for income, they tend to apply for the protection order.
Right.
And then the case is kind of heard through under the Domestic Violence Act.
Right.
And then there's that automatic kind of divorce that happens as well in that process. But for people who can afford it and who have the resources, um, they usually do not um, kind of go through the domestic violence procedures.
Mm.
They prefer to go through divorce procedures because it looks better for them.
Right.
And it's all a face thing. So there have been cases where we've had judges actually who have been living with domestic violence as well.
Right.
uh, these are educated women with money, and it happens to everyone.
Yeah. That's that's very interesting. I think it's good that you brought up that nuance to the understanding of why people sometimes make different decisions in these cases. And also perhaps why there might not be as many domestic violence cases on record. Um, let's see.
Sorry.
It's okay. On record because, as you say, that what is actually on official record may not actually be the reason for some of these separations and why people choose to leave. Okay, very interesting. Um, what about for people who have friends and family who might be experiencing domestic violence? So I'm guessing this includes some men as well who might be on the receiving end of
Yes.
violence.
Pe-
Um,
Sorry.
sorry.
Please finish your question.
So it could be anybody. who might be living with someone who is very violent towards them across different types of violence. So, what can friends and family do to support them and also maybe to help them if they are looking to come out of the situation?
Um, okay. So what can friends and family do? I guess the most important thing they can do is they can be two things. The first thing is to be a listener, to listen and not judge. And it's actually a lot harder than it sounds. And I think a lot of people don't, when they say that, yeah, I listen, and I'm like, I don't think you do. Um, because, even as we are listening, we tend to kind of rationalize,
Yeah.
things automatically. And I think it's very hard to kind of silence that voice and just purely listen to someone. And there are many people, many supporters who have done that, and from especially um, mothers who have to assist their children who are going through domestic violence, and a lot of them have this inner battle where they have to decide between social stigma and deciding what's best for the child, and both are kind of important, because as the mother to the child, she feels that she has to decide what's best for the family. And I've seen many people do a complete U-turn when it comes to supporting their children. And of course, learning to silence that voice that tends to rationalize other people's experience is one of the biggest and most important things that you can do for a loved one who is um, living in an abusive relationship. The second thing you can do is actually to be their cheerleader. Keep reminding them why they are doing this. Keep reminding them of their aspirations, keep reminding them of how strong they are, how brave they are. Keep reminding them of these things. Be their cheerleader. Every time they feel they can't do it, just tell them you can do it. You can take a break, but you have to do this. You can't give up. So I would say that both roles are equally important. And and it's good to have more than one person, because I think for one person to be both is difficult, and it's best to coordinate, like maybe two or three people to coordinate and kind of decide who is going to be the cheerleader and who is going to be the listener, and just be there all the time.
I think you mentioned earlier as well about people feeling like they're worthy um, of happiness and yeah, worth something as an individual. I think that's part of the cheerleading process as well, reminding them of that they're worth it, basically.
Yes, that's very true, because although we don't have statistics um, through our counseling services, a lot of people who sometimes come to us, they come to us when things have gotten really, really bad,
Mm.
and they feel really hopeless, or they feel that you know they can't. It's easier to die than to move on, or than to live. And I think that's really, really sad.
Yeah.
And that's something that I think people don't realize, that you know domestic violence kills. It literally kills people. You some people take their lives, some people die at the hand of their abusers, and for some people they just die inside, and that's really, really sad.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very, very important point. I think people it's again one of those things where we don't really hear so much about it if family doesn't want it publicized or no charges have been pressed. So the extent to which this violence can actually go is not as clear, I think, in the public consciousness as it should be. Um, very, very important point. So if from a practical standpoint they want to reach out to AWAM, how can they go about doing that?
So they can definitely call our helpline. Our number is 016 Sorry. Oh my gosh, I'm getting it confused with my phone number. Okay, it's 016-237-4221.
Okay.
And you can also you can reach out to our to us on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, and we'll get back to you.
Okay. I believe we'll be putting in all of this information in the description of this video, so anybody who wants to access that will be able to access it from the description. But it's very important that you have this information available in the event that you do need to reach out. And I think, as you mentioned before, it's important that they remember that it doesn't necessarily have to be at a point where you already are looking to leave. You could just be calling in to ask for advice on how to proceed if you fear that you might be in an abusive relationship and that you're just wanting to know what your options are and how to keep yourself and your family safe. I think that's also the function of these organizations. Um, and that's a very important message to put out there because, as you say, people sometimes call once things have escalated to the point where a lot of damage has already been done, and it doesn't have to get to that point before you
Ab-
can reach out.
Absolutely.
So, is there any other advice that you would like to offer to people about how they can recognize signs of domestic violence, whether it's in themselves, in their own relationships, or in others, before we close off this? Sure.
I think it's you see, a lot of people are under the assumption that when your wife nags at you or your husband nags at you, it's domestic violence. It's not. But if at any time you feel threatened emotionally, mentally, or physically, I think instinctively you kind of know that, this is violence. Um, and I think that's when you really need to kind of be aware of what's happening. And even if you're not sure, just speak to someone about it. And I would recommend either a mental health professional or organizations that are capable of dealing with this, rather than just asking your friend, because most often friends would say things like, um, you know uh, oh, just ignore him, or just ignore her, or girls are like that, or in the cases where men are survivors, right? Be a man, right? Like, you're a man, take charge of the relationship.
Yeah.
So this is not helpful, I feel. And I think it's, if at any time you're not sure, the best thing is to check with a professional or people who are qualified.
Mm. Oh, and I think you mentioned the LGBTQ community as well. Where would they be able to access any services if they're in such situations? Because, as you mentioned, IPV and all of that will not apply to them. But I'm,
um, Sorry.
but yeah, sorry. Where might they be able to seek advice and also counseling services and that sort of thing?
Okay, so to be honest, I'm not very familiar with the organizations that assist LGBTQ people,
Mm.
but you can come to AWAM, and I think you can contact other women's groups. Most of them tend to redirect cases to other NGOs that can kind of take on those cases. For AWAM, we do provide free counseling, and it applies to everyone. And we do give free legal information, and anyone can come to us for free legal information. You can also approach Justice for Sisters,
Mm.
and I think that Seed Foundation,
Right.
I think, also assists LGBTQ
Okay.
uh, community.
So that's very good to know that at least the women's rights organizations will at least provide frontline um, in advice for people who don't immediately fall within your purview, I think, and especially I guess for men as well. In particular, they may not know really where to seek help, and that whether or not they can even call somewhere like AWAM for advice. So it's good to know that they at least can get information from you on how to proceed, because this is a very pervasive issue, and as you say, with men it might be even more likely that they don't dare to say anything or even make a call because they don't know where to go. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
So earlier when you mentioned men, I started laughing, and that's because we get a lot of calls, because our name is AWAM, so it's All Women's Action Society. A lot of people call and they're like, oh, do you accept, male clients, or can men come and come to you for advice? And we're like, yeah,
Yeah, I think that's maybe a misconception that people have because it's women's aid, it's women's action. So,
exactly.
yeah, I think people don't realize that it's really about helping people in difficult situations and sometimes seemingly impossible situations. Okay, so it's very good that we cleared a lot of that up. Hopefully, that means that people have a more nuanced and deeper understanding of the situation, about what constitutes violence in relationships, and also about what they can do to help themselves and also to help others in these situations. Thank you so much for sharing all of that, Lochna. I think this has been a
You're
very
welcome.
informative and very useful session. And to everyone, thank you for tuning into this episode of the Empowering Lives video series. To find out more about AWAM support services, you can visit their website at www.awam.org.my. And we'll also share the contact details, as Lochna mentioned before, in the description below the video, including their WhatsApp line, and their social media pages, all of which you can contact directly for assistance. So thank you, and we hope to see you again in the next episode.